Welcome to Woven in True Crime, where we weave the most intriguing and disturbing real-life stories. Today, we bring you a tale that defies comprehension, diving into the shadows of the human mind. This is the story of Febrônio Índio do Brasil, Brazil's first documented serial killer, whose name became synonymous with a terror few dared to remember. Amid messianic delusions and a series of horrendous crimes, he carved his path with indecipherable symbols and macabre rituals, living as an enigma until his last breath. Get ready to explore this true story, erased from official records, but still echoing as a dark warning about the fragile boundary between sanity and madness. This is the story you will never forget. It was a suffocating summer night in 1927, the air thick with humidity and an oppressive silence. The streets of Rio de Janeiro, usually bustling, seemed to rest in an uneasy peace, as if sensing that something sinister was about to happen. Near a deserted trail that led into dense woods, a young boy, eyes wide and body stiff with fear, struggled to stay calm as a man of medium height and piercing gaze led him. This was Febrônio Índio do Brasil, a name that had not yet carried the weight of infamy but would soon become a whispered terror in the alleys and streets of the city. Febrônio, with calculated gestures and a voice that shifted between tender and fearsome, began to mutter disjointed words, a chant in a language of his own. The boy, terrified, felt his heart pounding wildly, thudding in his chest like a runaway drum. There was a darkness in Febrônio that transcended the physical. His eyes held a feverish gleam, as if they saw something beyond comprehension. The night wind carried the murmurs away, but the terror settled like a weight on the boy's shoulders. As the night advanced, what had started as the promise of honest work to help his family turned into an unimaginable nightmare. With almost ritualistic precision, Febrônio began to mark the boy's skin, tracing letters and symbols with insane accuracy. DC verses 7, he whispered, eyes wide with an expression of ecstasy. To him, it was the beginning of a sacred ritual, but to the victim, it was only pain and fear. Hours later, as the city began to wake, a muffled scream echoed through the forest and quickly died out in the air. The silence that followed was as heavy as the act that had just occurred. Yet, Febrônio did not act chaotically. To him, there was a logic, a reason that justified each macabre gesture. His obsession was driven by a vision that had haunted him since his youth, a mission given by a celestial apparition he claimed to have seen during a delirious moment. An angel with golden hair commanded, "Mark and purify." As the first light of morning bathed the hills of Rio de Janeiro, a tattooed, lifeless body lay in the clearing, dressed in an abandoned jacket and cap. It was a scene that would soon draw the attention of the authorities and mark the beginning of an investigation that would unveil one of Brazil's most disturbing criminals. But what no one could predict was that this body was merely the prologue to a much darker and more incomprehensible story. The body found in the clearing quickly became the center of a growing wave of whispers and fear in Rio de Janeiro. The boy, identified as Jehoka, just 10 years old, was known throughout the neighborhood as a clever and friendly child. It was common to see him running through the dusty streets, running errands for his mother or helping at his father's small shop. His absence did not go unnoticed, and the discovery of his body with symbols carved into his skin plunged the community into a state of panic. The city, with its old mansions and narrow alleys, was still recovering from memories of the Spanish flu and the economic hardships that followed. The population was accustomed to fighting daily challenges, but what they now faced was different, an evil that infiltrated the darkness and presented itself in a cruel form. Jehoka was not just a victim, he was a symbol of a tragedy that defied common understanding. The initial investigation was conducted with urgency and apprehension. The lead detective, a middle-aged man with a weary face and a thick mustache, did not hide his nervousness. A crime like this, with these markings, he muttered as he ran his fingers over the freshly arrived documents. The symbols tattooed on Jehoka's body were enigmatic, and their disturbing nature indicated this was no ordinary act of violence. Residents began to share stories that had once only been whispers: a man promising jobs, speaking with disarming confidence, and bearing an unflinching gaze. Many knew who he was, but few dared to say his name aloud: Febrônio Índio do Brasil. Some recalled him as a wandering healer, an improvised dentist who moved from town to town, while others said he was part prophet, part madman. The truth was that, until then, he had been a marginal figure, sometimes mocked, sometimes feared by those who knew his story. While the police tried to piece together the initial clues, the sensationalist newspapers wasted no time creating headlines steeped in mystery: "The Prince of Darkness," and "The Devil's Hand in Human Form." Conversations in markets and churches revolved around nothing else, and the tension spreading through the streets seemed to permeate the air everyone breathed. However, as the days passed, the first clues began to surface, and nothing was as it seemed. The discovery of Jehoka's body was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would challenge comprehension. The police, immersed in a chaotic scenario, were confronted with a puzzle whose pieces grew increasingly disturbing. Between testimonies and rumors, the story of a young survivor emerged who, weeks earlier, had escaped a similar situation. He had been approached by a man posing as a doctor who promised a job, but there was something deeply unsettling about his gaze and words. Sketches of symbols familiar to Jehoka's case appeared in his account, forming an undeniable connection. The investigation, once uncertain, took a clearer direction. Febrônio Índio do Brasil, previously mentioned in minor records as a man with a dubious past, now emerged as the prime suspect. His story began to be unearthed. Born into a large, dysfunctional family, he had known violence and abandonment since childhood. His path was marked by escapes and petty crimes, but what truly stood out was his belief in a divine mission, something that drove him with near-obsessive force. The markings found on Jehoka's body, DC verses 7, echoed his own words about purification and redemption. At a boarding house where Febrônio had stayed, investigators found papers scribbled with symbols similar to those tattooed on the victim and scattered notes about a celestial purification. The boarding house owner, described by neighbors as a stern woman, reported that Febrônio's behavior was peculiar. He spent long hours in silence, as if in a trance, and his few interactions were marked by an unyielding stare. The disappearances were not confined to Rio de Janeiro alone. Other cities began reporting similar cases, increasing the pressure on authorities. The investigation intensified, with agents scouring abandoned chapels and secluded places for clues. One such search led to the discovery of an improvised altar in a remote location, where melted candles and symbolic markings on the ground reflected Febrônio's peculiar cult and distorted vision of devotion. The net closed in, and the image of the man became clearer. Accounts from survivors helped build a profile, and an arrest warrant was issued. During a search in a more remote part of the city, Febrônio was spotted by a policeman. With calculated movements, he appeared prepared for capture, his eyes gleaming with a confidence that defied the situation. The evidence that emerged next would transform the case into something far more complex than a single isolated crime. Between documents and testimonies, it became clear that Febrônio did not view his actions as crimes but as part of a greater mission, rooted in delusions and a distorted interpretation of his spiritual significance. But what the police found next turned a simple disappearance into a much darker mystery than anyone could imagine. With Febrônio's capture, the investigation deepened and began to unravel a web of details that made it clear the case was more than an isolated act of violence. The police records, until then scattered, started forming a timeline of interconnected events. Petty crimes, suspicious practices, and accounts from those who had crossed his path began to merge into a narrative mixing madness and cold calculation. The name of Bruno Gabina, a dentist who had disappeared years earlier, resurfaced when old documents were found with Febrônio's forged signature. A careful search of the boarding house where he had stayed revealed an object that had previously gone unnoticed, a human skull, cooked and stored in a forgotten corner. Investigations pointed to the possibility that the skull belonged to Gabina, a grim indication that confirmed rumors Febrônio kept macabre mementos of his victims. The accumulated evidence indicated that his mind worked on two levels, that of a prophet, driven by visions of a divine mission, and that of a manipulator who knew how to exploit the trust of others. His journey through Brazil included stops in cities like Salvador and Belo Horizonte, always marked by reports of a healer offering herbal remedies and dubious practices. In all these cities, Febrônio's presence left a trail of suspicion and unease. The impact of his capture was immediate. The community of Rio de Janeiro, already shaken by the discovery of bodies with unmistakable markings, saw their fear turn into a morbid fascination. The newspapers exploited every detail with sensationalist headlines, turning Febrônio into a figure that straddled the line between human and demonic. However, forensic investigations advanced slowly, and the forensic system of the time could not provide conclusive answers for all the evidence found. In parallel, survivor testimonies began to emerge, each painting a portrait of a man who, with careful words and calculated gestures, lured his victims with promises of work or healing. Among the accounts, one detail recurred: Febrônio's insistence on tattooing specific symbols on his victims, always claiming it was part of a purification ritual. This supported the Son of Light persona he propagated, reinforcing the idea that his messianic delusion was more than a facade, it was the backbone of his actions. The details revealed by the police and forensic experts created an even darker picture. The mixture of dried blood and ink on makeshift needles found in his room, and the detailed drawings on yellowed papers, showed that his acts were premeditated, part of a cycle he believed was necessary to fulfill his mission. The fact that he had published a book years earlier, The Revelations of the Prince of Fire, which many considered incoherent and delirious, now appeared to be a crucial piece for understanding his disturbed mind. The only surviving copy of the book, filled with notes by Mario de Andrade, suggested that even intellectuals of the time had been drawn to the enigma of Febrônio. The Revelations added a new element of horror, the idea that he was not alone in his beliefs. Small circles of followers began to appear, fueled by fear and fascination, spreading the theory that he was a messenger of something greater. What had once been seen as a series of isolated acts now seemed to have the complexity of an emerging cult, driven by dread and curiosity. And then the evidence brought to light a long-buried secret, something no one was prepared to face. The 1928 trial of Febrônio Índio do Brasil was a spectacle that drew the attention of the entire city of Rio de Janeiro. The courtroom was packed with journalists, onlookers, and officials, all keenly watching as details unfolded during the testimonies and the presentation of evidence. The tension was almost palpable as prosecutors laid out the list of crimes and evidence linking him to a series of disappearances and murders. The climax of the trial was the psychiatric analysis conducted by the renowned Dr. Heitor Carrillo, whose detailed assessment revealed the true depths of Febrônio's mind. Carrillo described Febrônio as a rare case of psychopathy interwoven with messianic delusions. Analyses indicated that he genuinely believed in his visions and that his fixation on tattooing victims was part of a complex ritualistic structure combining violence and redemption. The psychiatric report stated that despite moments of apparent clarity and cunning, he was incapable of discerning the morality of his actions by society's standards. His behavior, according to Carrillo, was driven by a conviction so powerful that it rendered him immune to remorse or doubt. During the trial, physical evidence supported the conclusions of the report. Photographs of tattooed bodies, papers with symbol drawings, and the makeshift needles used for the tattoos were displayed, leaving the audience in silent horror. Survivor accounts of those who had escaped before their lives were taken completed the disturbing picture. Each meticulous detail shared by investigators added layers of complexity to Febrônio's profile, portraying him as a perverse combination of intelligence, charisma, and insanity. The details of the crimes raised the question of criminal responsibility. The defense argued that Febrônio, ensnared by delusions and unable to comprehend his actions, should be treated as an ill person, not as an ordinary criminal. However, the prosecution, backed by testimonies and public outcry for justice, emphasized that despite his hallucinations, he acted with premeditation and intent. The jury, caught between disbelief and fear, watched the evidence and testimonies with a mix of fascination and repulsion. As the trial progressed, the perception that Febrônio was not just a murderer but a figure who transcended common violence took hold of the courtroom. His self-proclaimed mission as the Son of Light began to be seen as the axis that sustained his chaotic mind. The connection between the book he published, the revelations of the Prince of Fire, and the crimes was scrutinized, and the confused, fragmented nature of his writings showed how delusions shaped his worldview. To many, it was evident that his psyche was profoundly damaged, but still, his capacity for manipulation and reasoning made him a unique threat. The final verdict was a turning point. Febrônio was declared criminally insane and, rather than being sent to a regular prison, was committed as the first patient of the newly created forensic psychiatric hospital. The trial not only sealed his fate but also exposed the fragility of institutions and society when faced with minds like his. Debates about morality, insanity, and punishment echoed for days, and Febrônio's name continued to reverberate as a warning that the line between madness and evil might be thinner than imagined. But despite all the answers that came forth, one question still lingered: what motivated all this? And was the whole truth ever revealed? Febrônio's declaration of criminal insanity did not bring relief to the public. Although he was confined to the forensic psychiatric hospital, his name continued to be whispered with a mix of fear and fascination. People still murmured stories about him, and legends grew like shadows stretching across the city. His presence, even absent, cast a specter over society, fueling discussions in cafes, squares, and newspapers. It was as if his figure had transcended the mere role of a criminal and become a sort of living ghost. Inside the asylum, Febrônio quickly stood out among the patients. His manipulative abilities, which had served him so well in freedom, allowed him to gain a certain respect among the inmates and even some less observant staff. Later reports noted that he exhibited cyclical behavior, moments of calm and obedience followed by outbursts when his old messianic beliefs surfaced in full force. During these episodes, he would murmur about being the Son of Light and recite passages from his book, which now many saw as a confused manifesto of his disturbed mind. Meanwhile, society tried to move on. The memory of the crimes, however, remained vivid, especially for the families of the victims. The trial and Febrônio's institutionalization sparked debate over the system's ability to deal with extreme cases of psychopathy and delusion. Historians and criminologists began to analyze his case as an emblematic example of the fragile boundaries between madness and evil. As the years passed, Febrônio became a figure almost forgotten by the new generation, but among scholars and those who remembered the crimes, his legacy remained as a dark warning. Documents and articles exploring the minds of early 20th century criminals always mentioned Febrônio as an outlier, someone whose blend of delusion and intelligence defied understanding. To many, his capture and confinement were not enough. The unease lay in the fact that, even within the walls of the asylum, Febrônio still behaved as if on a mission. This posture fueled speculation that he held unrevealed secrets, aspects of his life and crimes that remained hidden. The institution's silence regarding his internal activities only deepened the doubts. On the streets, Febrônio's legend merged with urban folklore. Children were warned not to misbehave under the threat that the Son of Light would come for them. Embellished stories and decades-old accounts painted a picture of a man who, even far away, seemed capable of exerting an almost mystical control over the collective imagination. The unease remained latent, a scar that never fully healed. The marks of his crimes lingered not just with the victims and survivors, but in a city that, for a brief and terrible period, had confronted an evil that challenged its deepest certainties. The name Febrônio Índio do Brasil became synonymous with a horror that could not simply be forgotten or erased. Despite the evidence, one crucial detail still did not fit. Something was out of place, and perhaps the story was not over. Febrônio Índio do Brasil spent decades confined in the forensic psychiatric hospital, out of the headlines and the public's curious eye. The generation that grew up fearing his stories aged, and for many, he became just a grim footnote in criminology and psychiatry books. However, within the walls of the asylum, he never ceased to be a prominent presence. His writings and sporadic murmurings about a divine mission continued to disturb both inmates and staff, creating an atmosphere where mystery and unease were constants. In the late 1970s, an investigation by a group of journalists revived Febrônio's name, bringing to light previously unknown details of his years of confinement. Leaked documents showed that he maintained notebooks filled with symbols and fragments of thoughts about the divine light and purification. These texts renewed academic and public interest, and criminologists began to reconsider his story. After all, his case represented something deeper than a simple act of violence. It was a dive into the mind of a man who believed he was in communion with something higher. Many of Febrônio's writings were considered incoherent, but certain passages revealed a pattern that had not been fully understood. Some phrases seemed to indicate that he did not act alone, that either in his mind or in some remote corner of the country, others shared his messianic vision. This unsettling possibility left researchers intrigued and the community uncomfortable. Could his acts have inspired a secret sect, or had his ideas somehow survived beyond the asylum walls? The impact of his death in 1984 was quiet. He died of emphysema at 89, physically ending a life marked by terror and controversy. His body was buried at the Caju cemetery, without ceremony, without farewells. To some, that was the definitive end of the legend. To others, the memory of his actions and beliefs continued to pulse like a sinister echo. Scholars who visited the asylum after his death found notebooks he had left behind, stored in dusty boxes. While they did not provide direct answers, the texts fueled new theories about the true extent of his influence. Over the years, Febrônio transformed into a myth that blended reality and fantasy. Some speculated that he still maintained contact with outsiders even in his final years, while others claimed his delusions were mere reflections of loneliness and mental decline. What is certain is that his figure continued to provoke debates about the nature of evil and the limits of sanity. For the city of Rio de Janeiro, the memory of Febrônio was a somber reminder of a time when understanding of mental disorders and violence was limited. The newspapers and books that had explored his story accumulated like relics of a past no one wanted to revisit but also couldn't completely ignore. Those who experienced the fear of his era learned to cope with the shadows he left behind, but new generations, upon hearing the accounts, wondered how much of the story had truly been told. Some contemporary researchers are still trying to piece together the missing parts. The notebooks he left behind, filled with symbolism and disconnected premonitions, are analyzed as part of a puzzle that may never be solved. Was Febrônio merely a madman, or was his belief in a greater mission a veil for something deeper and even more sinister? But to this day, the questions persist: what really happened behind Febrônio's acts? And have all the secrets been revealed, or is there still something dark waiting to be discovered?